The wind blew hot and dry across the North African desert, carrying with it the smell of oil, sand, and death. The year was 1944, and the war in North Africa had already burned through countless young men, German, British, Italian, American, leaving behind only silence and the distant echo of gunfire fatting across dunes. In a makeshift field hospital outside Bizerte, 23-year-old Klaus Bergman lay staring at the canvas ceiling, trying not to think about the pain in his leg. It had been 4 days since shrapnel tore through his thigh. The wound, once red and swollen, had turned a deep, sickly black. He knew what that meant. Gangrene, the death creeping from within. He tried not to move, not to breathe too deeply, but the pain was relentless, a hot, gnawing presence that pulsed with every heartbeat. Around him, men groaned softly, some praying, others whispering to mothers they'd never see again. The air stank of antiseptic, sweat, and fear, and beneath it all lay a heavier scent, decay. The doctors here were not German. They were Americans, the enemy. When the field hospital had been overrun after the retreat near Mejaz el Bab, Klaus had expected death, not from his wounds, but from the men in olive drab who had captured him. Back home, he had been told what Americans did to prisoners, how they tortured, how they mocked, how they left men to die. The propaganda had been relentless. To be taken alive was shameful enough. To fall into enemy hands was to surrender one's dignity, one's very humanity. Yet here he was alive. The medics who had carried him in had not struck him or spat at him. They had not called him a Nazi or an animal. They had placed him on a stretcher, tagged his wound, and carried him into the tent as if he were one of their own. That frightened him more than hatred could have. The flap opened suddenly and a gust of hot wind swept through. A man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform dusty and sweat-stained. His rank insignia gleamed faintly in the dim light. Captain Robert Bradley. His presence was calm, measured, his voice low but firm as he spoke to the nurses. The other wounded men fell quiet when he moved between the cots, checking bandages, asking questions, listening. When he reached Klaus, he stopped. "Name?" Klaus hesitated, expecting the words to come sharp, demanding. Instead, Bradley's tone was steady, almost gentle. "Klaus," he said at last, his voice weak, his accent thick. "Klaus Bergman, Jeffreiter, German Army." Bradley nodded once. He peeled back the bandage on Klaus's thigh. The wound had darkened further, the flesh looked brittle, dead. The smell hit them both, rot and salt. Bradley didn't flinch. He simply looked at the leg for a long moment, then met Klaus's eyes. "It's bad," he said quietly. "Very bad." Klaus swallowed hard. He understood enough English to know what was coming next. "Amputation?" he asked, forcing the word through cracked lips. Bradley hesitated, then motioned for a medic to fetch something. Moments later, another man entered, younger, red-haired, his sleeves rolled high. He carried a small metal box. "Captain," he said, "this is what we've got left." Inside were several small vials, their glass sides catching the faint light. Klaus watched them curiously, uncertain. Bradley turned one over in his hand. "Penicillin," the captain said. "New drug, only a few doses left." He looked down at the German prisoner. "It could work, or it might do nothing at all." Klaus frowned. He didn't understand. "For me?" he asked, disbelief in his tone. "You use that for me." Bradley studied him for a long moment. Then he said something Klaus never expected to hear from an enemy officer. "You're not my enemy right now, son. You're my patient." For a moment, Klaus thought he had misheard. Patient. The word felt strange, impossible. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. "Why?" he whispered. "Why help me?" Bradley exhaled slowly, almost sadly. "Because if we don't stop killing each other somehow, this never ends." And with that, the decision was made. Bradley ordered his medic, Eddie Morrison, to prepare the injection. Klaus closed his eyes, bracing himself. When the needle pierced his skin, he flinched. The burn of the drug spread through his veins, mingling with fear and disbelief. He didn't know what to think, that they might be experimenting on him, or that they might actually be trying to save him. The hours that followed were a haze. The fever climbed, his heart pounded, and at times he thought he would die anyway. But then something changed. By the second night, the swelling began to subside. The black edges of the wound softened, and the smell faded. The pain lessened. He could feel warmth in his leg again, the warmth of life returning. Bradley came by on the third morning. "It's working," he said simply. "You're lucky." Klaus stared at him, the word echoing in his mind. Lucky. In this place, surrounded by the wounded and the dying, he could hardly understand what luck meant anymore. Over the next few days, he began to see the camp not through fear, but through the strange lens of gratitude. Eddie, the red-haired medic, would bring him small comforts, a sip of water, a scrap of bread, a piece of chocolate. The nurse, Sarah Collins, always spoke softly, her hands gentle as she changed his dressings. "We heal who we can," she said once, as if explaining the entire philosophy of war in 5 words. For the first time since the invasion of North Africa, Klaus felt safe. At night, when the generator flickered and the desert wind hissed against the tent walls, he listened to the Americans talking, laughing even, as if the war was far away. He couldn't understand every word, but he could hear something in their voices he hadn't heard in months. Life. On the 5th night, a young American soldier limped into the tent and took the cot next to his. He was missing part of an ear and had shrapnel scars down his arm. His name was Tommy. He grinned when he saw the German staring at him. "Guess we're roommates now, huh?" he said cheerfully. Klaus blinked in confusion. "Roommates?" "Yeah," Tommy laughed. "You know, bed buddies, 2 lucky bastards who didn't die." Despite himself, Klaus smiled. Tommy's humor was crude, but it was human. The two began to talk in broken phrases, half English, half gesture. Tommy showed him a photograph of his wife holding a newborn baby. "Born while I was out here," he said, tapping the picture. "Haven't even met her yet." Klaus pulled from under his pillow a small, crumpled snapshot of his own family, his mother and younger sister, standing outside their farmhouse near Bremen. He pointed to it. "Home," he said simply. Tommy nodded. Same hell, different side. In that strange, fragile space, a hospital where enemy soldiers lay side by side, the lines between friend and foe began to dissolve. Klaus realized how much of his fear had been built from lies, from the voices that told him Americans were monsters. They were not. They were men, tired, hungry, frightened, just like him. Each day, Sarah's voice steadied him. She spoke of duty and kindness, not vengeance. "We're soldiers," she said once, rinsing his bandage in clean water, "but we don't stop being people." He carried those words with him long after the bandages came off. By the 7th day, he could sit upright without pain. The infection was gone. His leg was scarred but intact. When Bradley came to check the wound one last time, Klaus saluted him weakly. Bradley shook his head. "No salutes, you just get better." Klaus looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "Dank," he said. "Thank you." Bradley smiled faintly. "That's how this war ends, son, one thank you at a time." Outside, the wind still carried the sand and the echoes of battle. But inside that tent, for a brief, miraculous moment, humanity had taken root. Klaus didn't yet know that this encounter, this mercy, would change the entire course of his life. But in that small, sun-baked hospital in North Africa, he began to understand something no uniform, no flag, no order could erase. Even in war, compassion could survive. By the 3rd week of June 1944, the war in North Africa was over. The desert lay quiet now, but the ghosts still walked there, men like Klaus Bergman, lying half-healed under the same canvas where so many others had died. The field hospital had changed. Where once there had been chaos and shouting, there was now a strange, uneasy peace. The wounded had either recovered or been buried. The surgeons slept more than an hour at a time, and even the flies seemed fewer. But inside Klaus, a different kind of battle still raged, one between what he had been taught to believe and what he now knew to be true. Each day began the same. At dawn, the orderlies lifted the tent flaps to let in the first breath of cool air before the sun turned the camp into an oven. The smell of coffee mingled with disinfectant. Men groaned as bandages were changed, morphine needles hissed, and somewhere, a phonograph crackled out an old Bing Crosby song that sounded impossibly gentle in a place built for pain. Klaus lay near the back, his leg wrapped neatly now, the wound pink with new flesh. Eddie Morrison, the red-haired medic, came by with his usual grin. "Still breathing, Bergman?" he asked. Klaus nodded, smiling shyly. He had picked up enough English to understand the jokes now. Eddie always brought something, a spoonful of soup, a piece of hard candy, once even a cigarette he'd rolled himself. "You know," he said one afternoon, lighting it and passing it over, "when this is all over, maybe we'll sell milkshakes in some roadside diner. You'd be the cook, I'll take the tips." Klaus didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough to laugh. The sound startled him, a laugh, real and unguarded for the first time in years. It was Sarah Collins who noticed the change in him first. The nurse was young, maybe 25, with a calmness that defied the endless parade of blood and suffering she faced each day. Her uniform was always immaculate, her voice never raised. "You're healing," she told him, touching the bandage lightly. "You'll walk again." "Because of penicillin?" Klaus asked carefully, his accent thick. "Because of medicine," she said, "and because Captain Bradley believed you were worth saving." He stared at her. "Even though I am German." Sarah smiled, but there was sadness in it. "You're a man, that's enough." The words struck him harder than any bullet could have. He had grown up believing in division, in bloodlines, flags, and enemies. It had been the air he breathed. Now, in this tent of enemies who did not hate him, he began to suffocate on the truth. Outside, the war continued its brutal rhythm. From the edge of the camp, Klaus could hear distant artillery, a faint thunder from across the Mediterranean where the Allies had already landed in Italy. The war machine was moving north now, leaving behind men like him, broken pieces swept to the rear. Sometimes at night, he talked with Tommy, the American who slept in the cot beside him. They shared what little they could of their lives before the war. Tommy told him about baseball, about jukeboxes, about the smell of gasoline and fried onions in summer. Klaus told him about his father's farm, about wheat fields so wide they looked like the sea. They tried to find words for things neither fully understood. One evening, Tommy reached into his pocket and handed Klaus something small and square, a piece of chocolate wrapped in gold foil. "Here," he said, "American peace offering." Klaus turned it over in his fingers. "For me." "Hell yes, eat it before the flies do." He bit into it cautiously. The sweetness filled his mouth like a memory from childhood. For a moment he closed his eyes and the desert disappeared. He was back home, his mother laughing as she kneaded bread, the radio humming in the corner. When he opened his eyes, Tommy was watching him quietly. "Good, huh?" Klaus nodded. "Good," he said softly. "Very good." That night he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the slow rhythm of Tommy's breathing and the low murmur of voices outside the tent. The thought would not leave him that his supposed enemies had fed him, healed him, and saved his leg. Everything he had been told about them was a lie. Days passed, the desert heat grew cruel again, and with it came new convoys of prisoners. The camp filled with Germans who had not yet seen what Klaus had seen. Some still spat when the Americans passed. Others whispered curses. Klaus watched them, wondering how long it would take before they, too, understood. One afternoon, two guards led in a wounded German sergeant, his arm in a sling, his eyes blazing with fury. When he saw Klaus sitting up talking with Eddie and Sarah, he scowled. "Bergman," he hissed in German, "have you forgotten who you are? You sit with them, laugh with them." Klaus froze. The words were knives, sharp with the shame of his own doubt. For a heartbeat, he felt the old fear rise, fear of betrayal, of weakness, of being seen as less than loyal. But then Sarah turned, unaware of the German exchange, and smiled at him as she handed him a cup of water. Her kindness was unguarded, uncalculated. Klaus looked back at the sergeant. "They saved my life," he said quietly in his own language. "Would you rather I had died to prove I hated them?" The man sneered. "You sound like them already." "Maybe," Klaus said, "maybe that is not a bad thing." After that, the sergeant would not speak to him again, but Klaus no longer cared. By July, he was able to stand on crutches. The day he took his first step without pain, Eddie whooped so loudly that the nurses came running. "Damn, look at that! Fritz is walking again." Klaus grinned, balancing awkwardly. "Fritz walks," he said, pointing to himself. "Eddie talks too much." The laughter that followed drew others from nearby tents. For a moment, the war felt far away. That night, Captain Bradley came to see him. He stood by the cot, his expression thoughtful. "You'll be shipped soon," he said. "North to a proper POW camp. The war's moved on." Klaus nodded, his stomach twisting. He wanted to speak, but words seemed too small. Finally, he said, "I was afraid of you. Of all Americans, they told us you would kill us." Bradley looked at him, his gaze steady. "We were told the same about you." Klaus frowned. "And yet you saved me." Bradley sighed. "Because if we stop seeing the man under the uniform, the war wins twice." Klaus swallowed hard. "I will not forget." Bradley placed a hand on his shoulder. "Good, then the medicine worked better than I thought." The next morning, they loaded him into a transport truck bound for a prisoner camp in Tunisia. As the engine rumbled to life, Klaus looked back at the tents, the white canvas flapping gently in the breeze, the figures of nurses moving between them like ghosts of mercy. He caught a glimpse of Sarah waving. Tommy saluted with two fingers and shouted something he couldn't quite hear over the roar. He lifted his hand, the gesture shaky but sure. For a moment, it felt like a goodbye to more than people, to an old life, an old way of thinking. As the truck disappeared into the horizon, the desert swallowed the tracks behind it. Klaus didn't know where the war would take him next, whether he would see Germany again, or what would become of the friends he had made among his enemies. But he carried something with him now that could not be taken by force or propaganda. He had learned that humanity, once given, could never truly be forgotten. And for the first time since he had marched under the swastika, he allowed himself to believe that there might still be something worth saving in the world. The prisoner transport crawled north through the broken bones of Tunisia, its tires grinding over sand and gravel that glittered in the burning sun. Inside, Klaus Bergman sat among a dozen other captured Germans, each lost in his own private silence. The smell of dust and sweat filled the back of the truck. Flies clung to faces too tired to swat them away. For most of the men, the surrender had not yet sunk in. The desert had swallowed their pride, their army, their war. All that remained was heat and shame. Klaus leaned against the wooden sideboard, his legs stiff but healing. Every jolt sent a dull ache up his thigh. He was grateful for the pain. It meant the limb was still his. He glanced around at the others, boys and old men mostly, and realized that he was no longer one of them. Something had shifted inside him during those weeks in the American hospital. They saw only captors and cages ahead. He saw faces: Eddie, Tommy, Sarah, Bradley, the people who had refused to let him die. When they reached the prisoner of war camp outside Tunis, the air reeked of humanity and dust. Rows of barbed wire stretched to the horizon, enclosing neat grids of tents. American guards watched from towers with machine guns slung lazily across their chests. It wasn't cruelty that filled the place, but monotony. The war had turned men into inventory. A sergeant barked orders as they filed through processing. Each man's name was taken, his rank recorded, his possessions confiscated. When they reached Klaus, an officer looked up from his clipboard. "Bergman Klaus, 23, infantry." He peered at the scar on Klaus's thigh. "You're one of Captain Bradley's patients, aren't you?" Klaus hesitated, then nodded. "Lucky man," the officer said, signing off. "He's got a reputation, treats everyone like they're his own boys." Klaus swallowed hard. Lucky. The word kept following him like a shadow. Inside the compound, time melted. The days blurred into one another, measured only by the rations, bread, soup, coffee that tasted of rust. The camp itself was strangely ordered. The Americans enforced discipline, but there was no malice in it. The guards spoke to them like men, not animals. The Red Cross trucks came twice a month, delivering parcels of food, letters, and sometimes books. There were lectures on English, even classes for those who wanted them. It was not freedom, but it was dignity. For Klaus, the adjustment came slowly. He still dreamt of home, of his mother's hands kneading dough, of his sister's laughter. But each morning when he woke under the harsh African sun, the bitterness faded a little more. He began to help where he could, carrying water for the infirm, translating between guards and prisoners when tempers flared. The Americans noticed. One afternoon, an officer stopped him at the gate. "Bergman," he said, "you speak English well. We could use you as an interpreter." Klaus hesitated. "For the Americans." The officer shrugged. "For both sides." He agreed it was better than idleness. And so, the days filled with purpose again. He stood between men who had once aimed rifles at each other and turned their words into bridges instead of bullets. He learned that translation was more than language. It was empathy, the act of carrying meaning safely across hostile ground. By late summer, letters began to arrive. The first one came in a Red Cross envelope, the handwriting neat and careful. It was from his mother, written from Bremen. The house had been hit by bombs, she said, but she was alive. His sister Greta had been evacuated east. The letter ended simply, "We pray you are being treated kindly. Remember who you are." He read that line over and over. He wasn't sure anymore who he was, the soldier who had believed in victory, or the man who had been saved by his supposed enemies. In September, word spread through the camp that Captain Bradley was visiting. The men whispered his name like a rumor of good fortune. When he finally arrived, the guards saluted him without ceremony, and the prisoners stood at attention out of respect rather than fear. He walked through the rows of tents, speaking to men who had once fired at him, asking about their health, their families, their wounds. When he reached Klaus, his eyes lit faintly. "Well," he said, "how's the leg holding up?" Klaus straightened, half smiling. "Still here, sir, thanks to you." Bradley nodded. "You did the hard part, you lived." He looked around at the camp. "Not the worst place to wait out a war, is it?" Klaus shook his head. "No, sir, not the worst." For a moment they stood in silence. Then Bradley said, "Remember this, Bergman. When this is over, and it will be, men will have to decide whether to build or to hate. You've already made your choice." When he left, Klaus felt a strange ache in his chest. Gratitude, pride, and something deeper. Something like hope. Weeks later, a truck brought a fresh group of prisoners from Italy, hollow-eyed men who had seen the front collapse around them. Among them were fanatics, still clutching Hitler's name like a prayer. They spoke of betrayal, of vengeance, of a world gone mad. Klaus listened quietly but no longer believed their words. He had seen another world, one not built on slogans. He found work helping the camp's chaplain distribute mail and supplies. It wasn't much, but it gave him a reason to move, to speak, to matter. In his spare time, he began to write first short notes in English, then longer passages. He wrote about the hospital, about the faces of the people who had saved him, about the taste of chocolate and the sound of a woman's voice saying, "You're a man. That's enough." The war dragged on. News trickled through the camp like smoke: Normandy, Paris, the Russians at Warsaw. Each headline carried the weight of a collapsing empire. By early 1945, even the most loyal officers stopped pretending they believed in victory. One morning in March, Klaus woke to find the guards unusually quiet. The commandant gathered them together in the yard. "Germany has surrendered in the West," he announced. "The war is ending." No one cheered. Some men wept openly, others stared into the dust. For Klaus, the words landed softly, like something inevitable. Over the next months, the prisoners were processed for release or relocation. Many would be sent to camps in Europe. Others, like Klaus, would remain to assist Allied units. His English and calm demeanor made him valuable. When the orders came, he was reassigned to a liaison office helping communicate with surrendered German officers. As he packed his few belongings, a notebook, a Red Cross pen, and the photograph of his family, he found himself staring at his reflection in a dented canteen. The face that looked back was thinner, older, but clearer somehow. The war had stripped him of everything but his humanity, and somehow that had made him whole. Before he left, he wrote a letter to Captain Bradley. It was short, clumsy, but honest. "You saved my leg, but more than that, you saved my faith. Not faith in God or country, but in people. I will try to live in a way that honors that gift." He didn't know if the letter would reach him. He sent it anyway. As the truck carried him away from the camp, the desert shimmered once more in the heat. But this time, the horizon didn't look like an ending. It looked like a beginning, a line he would cross into a world waiting to be rebuilt. For the first time since he'd worn a uniform, Klaus Bergman felt free. The war ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. In the spring of 1945, Europe collapsed into silence, a silence thick with the smell of smoke, rubble, and disbelief. Cities that had once glowed with the hum of civilization were now gray carcasses. Bridges dangled into rivers, churches stood roofless, and roads were clogged with refugees dragging their lives in carts and sacks. For millions, victory meant only survival. When Klaus Bergman stepped off the transport truck in Bremen that summer, he hardly recognized his own country. The once proud city was a skeleton of steel and soot. The air was heavy with the ghostly sound of wind through ruins. His family's house was gone, replaced by a crater where weeds now grew. He stood at the edge of what used to be his street and stared at the emptiness, unsure whether to weep or feel nothing at all. He had expected sadness. He hadn't expected quiet, the kind of quiet that hummed like a wound still bleeding beneath its bandage. He found his mother a few days later in a relief camp near Oldenburg. She was thinner now, her hair silver, but her eyes, those fierce, proud eyes, were the same. When she saw him, she dropped the pot she was carrying and ran to him, her cry breaking the stillness. They clung to each other amid the stares of others who had long forgotten what reunion sounded like. For days they spoke little. Words seemed too fragile for what they had both endured. But at night when the lanterns burned low, Klaus told her about the Americans, how they had saved him, how they had treated him like a man, not a prisoner. His mother listened silently, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she said softly, "Then maybe God was watching after all." In the following months, life began its slow crawl toward order. The Allies occupied Germany with methodical precision. Food was scarce, homes scarcer. Men who had once worn uniforms were now lined up for work assignments. Klaus, because of his fluent English and steady nature, was given a position as a translator for the American forces in Bremen. His first day in uniform again, a different kind now gray jacket, no insignia, felt strange. He walked into the office where the stars and stripes hung beside a worn-out map of Germany. The officers looked up as he entered. "You're Bergman?" one asked, glancing at the file. "You worked with Captain Bradley's unit in North Africa." Klaus nodded. The officer smiled faintly. "Then you already know what we're about." He did. It wasn't conquest, it was repair. His new work was to stand between worlds, between Germans too proud or ashamed to speak English and Americans too wary to trust. He translated orders, documents, letters home, but more than that, he translated hearts. He explained to the Americans why so many civilians refused aid, pride, not defiance. He told the Germans that the Americans' sternness was not hatred but procedure. Slowly, through words and patience, he helped build something no army could capture, understanding. Yet even as he worked, memories from the field hospital returned at unexpected moments. When he handed an American soldier a cup of water, he thought of Sarah's hands doing the same for him. When he saw a German child clutching a rationed chocolate bar, he saw Tommy's grin and the gold foil wrapper that had changed his world. The war had divided nations, but small mercies were knitting them together again, one gesture at a time. One afternoon, while sorting mail for translation, he saw a familiar name on an envelope, Captain Robert Bradley. The address was a stateside hospital in Boston. The letter was from an officer stationed in Bremen, a medical officer thanking Bradley for his earlier service and reporting on the use of penicillin in the new German relief centers. Klaus read the name twice, then sat staring at it. Bradley was alive. That night he wrote a letter of his own. He struggled over every word, trying to find a balance between gratitude and confession. Finally, he began. "Dear Captain Bradley, you may not remember me, but I will never forget you. My name is Klaus Bergman. I was the wounded German soldier you treated in North Africa. You gave me penicillin when others might have let me die. You told me I was your patient, not your enemy. Those words became my compass in a broken world. I have come home to ruins, but I am alive, and I am trying to build something better. I now work as a translator for the American forces. Every day I see the faces of men learning that mercy can heal faster than hatred can destroy. You taught me that. I wanted you to know that your kindness has not been lost to time. It lives on in me and in those I now help." He signed it simply, Klaus, and mailed it before he could change his mind. Weeks passed. Then one morning, as he arrived at the office, the clerk handed him an envelope stamped United States Army Medical Corps. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a short note, typed neatly but with a few handwritten words added in blue ink. "Dear Klaus, of course I remember you. You were one of my first real tests of faith. I told myself that if penicillin could heal an enemy, then maybe it could heal a world. I'm glad to hear you're helping bridge the gap. Keep doing it. Healing doesn't end when the wounds close. It only begins there. Maybe one day our paths will cross again. Robert Bradley." Klaus read the letter until the words blurred. For the first time since the war ended, he allowed himself to believe in the future. Over the next few years, that belief grew. Germany rebuilt itself, not in grandeur but in humility. Streets filled again with the sound of hammers instead of bombs. Children went to school, factories roared back to life. Yet beneath it all was a cautious gratitude toward the Americans who had, against every instinct of vengeance, chosen compassion. Klaus's job expanded. He was sent to assist in repatriation offices, helping families separated by war find each other. It was painstaking work, cross-referencing lists, decoding names, translating desperate pleas. But every time a mother recognized her son's name or a husband learned his wife had survived, Klaus felt something inside him ease, as if he were repaying a debt that could never truly be settled. One day, a British journalist visited the liaison office. He was writing an article on former POWs who had chosen to work with the Allied administration. "Why do you do it?" he asked, scribbling in his notebook. Klaus thought for a moment before answering. "Because when I was wounded, I expected cruelty. Instead, I found kindness. If we only remember what divides us, the war never ends." The journalist nodded slowly and wrote down every word. That evening, as Klaus walked home through the quiet streets of Bremen, the air smelled faintly of rain and coal smoke. He passed a bakery where the first loaves in months were cooling on racks. People were laughing again, softly, uncertainly, but laughing. He stopped and looked up at the sky, where the clouds were breaking just enough for light to spill through. He thought of the hospital tent, of Bradley's steady hands, of Sarah's calm eyes. He thought of the boy Tommy, who had spoken of jukeboxes and gasoline and home. He wondered if they had survived, if they had found peace. He would never know for sure, but he carried them with him in every word he translated, every hand he extended across the divide. They were part of him now, the proof that mercy, once given, could cross borders the war had burned to ash. That winter, he received another letter from America. This one was written in a woman's delicate hand. Dear Mr. Bergman, I am writing on behalf of Captain Bradley, who has been gravely ill but wanted me to tell you something. He said that the letter you sent him meant more than any medal he ever received. He said it proved that sometimes one life saved can make the world a little less cruel. He asked me to tell you that you were never just his patient. You were his reminder of what we were fighting for. Klaus sat by the window as snow began to fall over Bremen. He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the one Bradley had sent months before. Outside, children's voices rang through the cold air, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of war pressing on his chest. He didn't know it yet, but the story between him and the Americans was far from over. For now, it was enough to know that healing had begun, not in hospitals or governments, but in the quiet decision of one man to see another not as an enemy, but as a human being. By 1950, Germany was no longer the land of ruins that Klaus Bergman had returned to 5 years earlier. The rubble still lined the edges of cities, but life had begun to rise from it, cautious, deliberate, determined. Smoke once again curled from factory chimneys, not as a signal of war, but of work. The Allied occupation had softened into administration, and new governments were forming under the uneasy watch of both Washington and Moscow. But for men like Klaus, the war lived on in memory more than in politics. He was 30 now, though the mirror told him he was older. The years between surrender and rebuilding had etched lines across his face that time alone couldn't smooth. But in his eyes there was something else, a steadiness born from having walked through the worst and still believing in what could be repaired. His work as a translator had taken him to Frankfurt, where American officers managed reconstruction and education initiatives. His job was simple on paper: facilitate communication between local German officials and U.S. representatives. In practice, it was far more delicate. Mistrust lingered like a shadow. Some Germans still saw occupation where others saw opportunity. Some Americans still saw enemies where others saw partners. Klaus existed between them, fluent in both languages, fluent in both silences. Each morning he arrived at the converted municipal building that served as headquarters for the Allied mission. The smell of coffee and typewriter ink filled the hallways. His desk sat beside the communications office, where dispatches from the States arrived in thick envelopes stamped Army Liaison Division. One day in late autumn, a letter arrived addressed to Mr. Klaus Bergman, interpreter, Frankfurt office. The sender's name made his breath catch. R. Bradley. He tore it open carefully. The paper smelled faintly of antiseptic and sea air, as if it had traveled through both hospital wards and harbors to reach him. Dear Klaus, I am writing this from Boston, where I've been stationed for rehabilitation work. I'm slower these days, but the spirit's still willing. I've read your reports through mutual friends. It seems you've become something of a bridge builder yourself. I knew you would. I've always believed that mercy has a ripple effect. You save one life, it touches another, and so on until maybe the whole world shifts a little. I don't know if I'll ever get back to Europe, but if I do, I hope we can meet not as doctor and patient, but as two men who chose not to hate. R.B. Klaus set the letter down slowly. The memory of the field hospital in North Africa returned in fragments: the canvas walls, the faint hum of insects, the sound of Bradley's voice saying, "You're not my enemy right now, son." He hadn't realized how much he'd missed hearing that voice until now. He began writing immediately, the words flowing with ease he hadn't known he still possessed. He told Bradley about Bremen, about his mother's recovery, about the cautious optimism that filled the new Germany. He wrote of the children learning English in schools rebuilt from ruins, of Americans helping distribute milk and textbooks instead of bullets and orders. At the end, he wrote simply, "You taught me how to heal. Now I am trying to teach others to listen." Weeks later, a reply arrived, short, typed, signed in shaky handwriting. "You're doing God's work, Klaus. Never think otherwise." The letters continued for years, crossing the Atlantic like fragile vessels of peace. Sometimes months passed between them, sometimes longer. But each exchange carried the same quiet warmth, a reminder that the line between former enemies could become a lifeline instead. By 1955, the Cold War had settled across Europe like frost, but the friendship between the two men endured. Klaus had married a schoolteacher named Maria, a woman with kind eyes and a laugh that reminded him of rain after drought. They lived modestly in a small apartment overlooking the main river. Every evening, he walked home past the rebuilt cathedral whose bells once again rang freely. Maria knew of Bradley, knew the story of the hospital, the penicillin, the wound that had nearly cost him his leg and his soul. "You should visit him," she said one night, folding his letter carefully after reading it. "You both talk of peace, but sometimes peace needs faces, not just words." Klaus smiled, shaking his head. Perhaps one day. That one day came unexpectedly. In 1957, he received a telegram from Boston. Bradley was retiring from the Army Medical Corps. His health was poor, but he wanted to invite Klaus to the United States, to meet the man I saved and the friend I gained. Maria insisted he go. She sold her wedding ring to help fund the trip. "I'll get another someday," she said, pressing the ticket into his hand. "But you only meet your destiny once." The voyage across the Atlantic was long and cold, but Klaus hardly noticed. Every night on deck, he stared at the horizon, thinking how strange it was that he was traveling not as a soldier, but as a guest, not to invade, but to visit. When the ship docked in New York, the skyline took his breath away. The city was alive, loud, immense, unapologetically new. It was everything post-war Europe was still learning to be. From there, he took a train north to Boston. Bradley was waiting at the station. He was older now, walking with a cane, his hair almost white, but the eyes were the same, calm, watchful, steady. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Bradley smiled. "Well," he said, voice rough with age, "looks like the penicillin worked after all." Klaus laughed, a sound half choked by emotion. "More than you know, Captain." Robert, the American, corrected softly. "No ranks today." They spent the afternoon in a small diner near the harbor. They talked about everything, the war, the peace, the small mercies that had shaped their lives. Bradley spoke of Sarah Collins, the nurse who had later run a clinic for war orphans. Eddie Morrison, the red-haired medic, had gone home to Iowa, married, and opened a pharmacy. Tommy, the cheerful soldier, had not made it home. His jeep hit a mine days after the liberation of Sicily. When Bradley said his name, both men fell silent. Klaus raised his glass. "To Tommy," he said. "He showed me how to smile again." "To Tommy," Bradley echoed. When they parted that evening, the sun was setting over the harbor. Bradley's hand trembled slightly as he gripped Klaus's shoulder. "You were the proof I needed," he said quietly. "That what we did, what we believed, wasn't wasted." Klaus's eyes burned. "You gave me my life," he said, "but you also gave me my conscience." Bradley nodded, his expression distant. "That's the real medicine, son." They wrote to each other until Bradley's death 5 years later. His final letter arrived in Bremen, written in the same unsteady hand. "Don't let the world forget that mercy wins wars more surely than bullets. If ever you doubt that, look at your leg and remember what kindness can save." Klaus folded the letter and placed it beside the others, tied neatly with a ribbon Maria had chosen for him. The next morning, he walked along the river as the fog lifted from the water. The bells of Frankfurt rang, just as the church bells had in Bremen years before. The sound was the same across oceans and decades, the sound of endurance, of faith rebuilt from ruin. He stopped on the bridge, watching the water flow beneath him. It reminded him of the endless crossing of letters between continents, between hearts once divided by hate. There on that bridge, he understood what Bradley had meant all along. Healing wasn't a moment, it was a lifetime. And though war had taken his youth, it had given him something far greater, the knowledge that even the smallest act of compassion could ripple across history. The years passed, quietly at first, then all at once. The war that had once defined Klaus Bergmann's life became history, and history began to fade into memory. By the early 1960s, West Germany was thriving. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, had transformed rubble into factories, hunger into trade, and silence into song. New cars lined the streets, new buildings rose where ashes had been, and people began to smile without guilt. But Klaus, now in his 40s, lived between two worlds, one of progress and one of remembrance. He was respected in his community, a trusted interpreter for local officials and visiting Americans. His house was modest but full of warmth, a garden tended by his wife, Maria, and a small study lined with letters bound in fatting ribbon. He still read them sometimes at night when the rain tapped the windowpane. Captain Bradley's words, Sarah's handwriting on a card she had once sent, Eddie's short note enclosed with a photograph of his pharmacy. Every letter was a fragment of another life, another proof that mercy had once triumphed in a time built for hate. Sometimes, when he walked home from work, he saw the younger generation, boys with new dreams, girls laughing in cafes, and wondered if they could ever understand the world he had lived through. The war had left scars invisible to them, and that was, perhaps, the truest sign of healing. But there was also danger in forgetting. One autumn evening, Klaus was invited to speak at a small American base outside Frankfurt. It was not a formal event, a gathering of soldiers and officers who were too young to have fought in World War II. They had heard about him from one of the senior officers, who had found his name mentioned in an old Army medical journal. When Klaus arrived, the men stood politely, uncertain of what to expect. He smiled and waved them down, taking the small wooden stage with no notes in hand. "I was your enemy once," he began in English, "and I was dying." A murmur rippled through the room. He told them about North Africa, about the sand, the fever, the smell of his own leg rotting beneath the bandage. He told them about Captain Bradley and the experimental drug called Penicillin, how the American doctor had offered him a choice when everyone else had given up on him. "He could have let me die," Klaus said softly. "But instead, he saved me. He said I wasn't his enemy anymore, I was his patient. Those words changed everything." He spoke for nearly an hour, not about battles or victories, but about the small mercies that never made it into history books, a shared cigarette, a nurse's voice in the night, a soldier's laughter in the face of despair. When he finished, the room was silent. Then one young corporal raised his hand and asked, "Do you think people can really forgive after something like that?" Klaus thought for a long time before answering. "Forgiveness," he said, "is not the absence of memory, it is the choice to remember without hate." The officer nodded slowly. When the meeting ended, they lined up to shake his hand. One of them pressed a folded envelope into his palm, an invitation from the U.S. consulate to attend a cultural exchange program in Washington the following year. Klaus didn't decide right away, but as he walked home through the cool night air, the sound of distant jazz from a nearby bar drifting across the street, he thought of Captain Bradley's last words, "Mercy wins wars more surely than bullets." The next spring he crossed the Atlantic again, this time as an honored guest. He stood at podiums, spoke to students and soldiers, diplomats and nurses. Everywhere his message was simple. The war ended when we stopped killing our humanity. Reporters wrote about him. One article in the Boston Globe called him the German who found peace in an American hospital. He disliked the title. It made him sound like a saint. He was. He was just a man who had once been afraid and had learned to stop being so. In Washington, he visited the National Archives, where an officer led him to a display about wartime medicine. Behind glass was a photograph, a black and white image of Captain Robert Bradley, sleeves rolled to the elbows, tending to a wounded soldier. The caption read, "American medical staff treating enemy prisoners, Tunisia, 1944. He stared at it for a long time. It was him in the picture, thinner, broken, eyes half closed from fever. He touched the glass, his reflection overlapping the image. "Thank you," he whispered. Afterward, he wrote a letter to Sarah Collins, now retired in Illinois. He thanked her for the humanity she had shown when the world was collapsing. A month later, a reply came in shaky handwriting. "We did what we were supposed to do. You're the proof that it mattered." In the years that followed, Klaus made it his mission to keep that proof alive. He worked with local schools to establish exchange programs between German and American students, teaching them not just English, but empathy. "It's harder to fear someone whose language you speak," he would tell them. He spoke at veterans' gatherings and international forums, not as a politician or scholar, but as a witness. By the 1970s, his hair had turned gray and his limp had worsened with age. Yet whenever he told his story, his voice carried the same quiet strength it had the day he first spoke it aloud. "A soldier once saved my leg," he'd begin, "and in doing so he saved my soul." When he received word that a small memorial hospital in Bremen was to be dedicated in honor of post-war humanitarian aid, he was asked to give the opening speech. On the morning of the ceremony, he walked slowly to the podium, cane in hand, the crowd of nurses, students, and veterans watching in silence. The air was thick with the scent of lilacs and rain. Many years ago, he said, a man gave me a gift, not just life, but a chance to become something better than I was. He saw in me not a prisoner, not a soldier, but a person. That gift became my duty, to see others as he saw me. He paused, looking out at the rows of faces, at the flags of both nations fluttering side by side. If war teaches us to hate, he said quietly, then mercy must teach us to remember. When the applause came, it was gentle, almost reverent. He stepped down, the sound of clapping fading behind him, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he could hear Captain Bradley's voice in the wind, the same calm tone that had steadied him all those years ago. That evening he returned home and sat at his desk by the window. The letters still rested there, neatly tied, the ink fading but the words eternal. He added one more, a final note written to a man long gone. My dear Robert, the world you hoped for is still imperfect, but it is better than the one we left behind. There are still wars, still hatred, still wounds. But every day I see acts of kindness that remind me of what you taught me. You said healing begins where hate ends. I have spent my life trying to live by that truth. If you can hear me somehow, know this. Your mercy did not end with me. It became a bridge between nations, between generations. It became hope. He signed his name slowly, Klaus Bergman, and placed the letter atop the stack. Then he blew out the candle and let the night settle in around him, soft and forgiving. Outside, the city hummed with life, the distant murmur of traffic, the faint laughter of children, the echo of bells over the river. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the sounds blended with the memory of desert winds and the voice that had once told him, "You're not my enemy. You're my patient." And with that memory, Klaus drifted into sleep, not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as a man finally at peace with the world he had once feared. By the time the new century dawned, Klaus Bergman was an old man. His hair had turned the color of ash, his gait had slowed, and his hands trembled when he held a pen. Yet his eyes, still blue, still bright, carried the same calm clarity they had when Captain Bradley first looked into them beneath the canvas of that field hospital in 1944. The world around him had changed beyond recognition. Germany was no longer a nation divided by rubble or ideology. Children played in parks where bomb craters had once yawned. The American flags that had once flown over occupation zones now fluttered beside German ones in friendship. The cities were alive again, modern and gleaming. But in the quiet of his study, with the soft ticking of an old clock, Klaus still felt the weight of history, his own and the world. He lived in Bremen again in a modest home near the river. Maria had passed away several years earlier, and his daughter, Elise, visited often with her own children. They adored their grandfather, though to them he was just Opa Klaus, the kindly old man who always told stories about faraway deserts and doctors who saved lives instead of taking them. They didn't fully understand that the stories were real, that they were, in many ways, alive because of them. On quiet evenings, Klaus would sit by the window and reread the letters that had defined his life. The ink had faded, but the voices still spoke. Bradley's calm reasoning, Sarah's soft gratitude, Eddie's humor. Even the official army letter announcing Bradley's death decades ago still smelled faintly of hospital paper and sea salt. Each letter was a thread, and together they wove the fabric of something greater than friendship, proof that compassion once given could echo forever. He often wondered if anyone still remembered Bradley in America. Time had a way of erasing even the best men, but then again, perhaps that didn't matter. The legacy of mercy was not meant to be famous. It was meant to be lived. In 2002, on a spring morning filled with birdsong and the smell of rain, Klaus woke feeling unusually tired. Elise was visiting that week, preparing breakfast while her children played in the yard. He sat at his desk and looked out the window where the river gleamed like liquid silver. The same river he had walked beside as a boy, as a returning prisoner, as a father, and as a man trying to reconcile two worlds. He opened the drawer and pulled out his writing set, the same one Maria had given him on his 50th birthday. Slowly, with the shaky care of someone who knows this might be his last act, he began to write. To whoever finds this letter, my name is Klaus Bergman. If you are reading this, then you live in a world I could only dream of when I was young. I was a soldier once in a war that destroyed everything it touched. I was wounded, afraid, and filled with hate. But then I met men and women who saw past the uniform, who chose compassion over revenge. They saved my life, but more than that, they saved my faith in humanity. I spent my years trying to live by their example. I have learned that mercy is not weakness. It is courage, the courage to see yourself in the eyes of the one you once called enemy. If you ever find yourself in a time of division, remember this. The world only heals when someone decides to care first. There is a name I wish never to be forgotten. Captain Robert Bradley, United States Army Medical Corps. He showed me that healing is stronger than hate. Because of him, I lived not just to grow old, but to understand. If you visit America someday, find his name in their records and say thank you for me. He set the pen down, folded the letter neatly, and placed it among the others, those faded messages that spanned continents and decades. Then he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the steady sound of the river carry him towards sleep. When Elise came to check on him an hour later, she found him there, peaceful, a faint smile on his face. His hands rested on the stack of letters, as if still guarding them. She wept softly, not from sorrow alone, but from awe at the serenity in his expression. Days later, at his funeral, the church was filled with people, neighbors, students, veterans, Americans from the nearby consulate who had come after hearing his story. On the altar, beside the cross, Elise placed the letters. The priest read aloud a passage from one of them. Healing doesn't end when the wounds close. It only begins there. When the service ended, a young American officer approached Elise. "Your father's name is known to us," he said quietly. "There's a file in our archives, his story, Captain Bradley's report, everything. It's used now in training. They teach new medics about compassion in wartime. They call it the Bergman Principle." Elise smiled through her tears. "Then he's still doing his work," she whispered. Years later, in a museum in Washington, a new exhibit was unveiled. The Humanity of War. Among the photographs was one of Captain Bradley beside his patient, the caption simple and clear. "Two soldiers, one wounded, one healing, both victorious." Beside it, a glass case held a yellowed letter addressed, "To whoever finds this." Visitors often lingered there longest, reading the words that had crossed generations. And somewhere, perhaps in the rhythm of a medic's heartbeat, in the soft whisper of a nurse comforting a frightened man, in the hand of a soldier offering water to a prisoner, the spirit of that long-ago field hospital lived on. Because mercy, once given, never dies. It passes from hand to hand, from war to peace, from one human heart to another, an unbroken chain of grace forged in the darkest of times. In the end, Klaus Bergman was not remembered as a German or a prisoner or a survivor. He was remembered simply as a man who proved that even in war, compassion can endure. And that one act of kindness, given in a desert tent beneath the roar of distant guns, can echo across 100 years and still be heard.